Good evening and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name's Allan Little, I'm a journalist and broadcaster, and I chair the board of trustees of this wonderful festival. It's great to see so many people out as usual, and I want to say that it's one of the privileges of taking part in this festival, in this role, is you get to share a stage with people of occasionally genuinely global stature, people whom I admire and who inspire me. And tonight is one of those examples. You all know who Elif is. I'm going to ask you now just to welcome, please, Elif Shafak.
Thank you.
This is Elif's latest book, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world. It's nominated on the Booker long list. The short list is out in a couple of weeks. We wish you great success in that, Elif. But we're not here to talk about the book. Elif is doing a separate event about that tomorrow. We're here to talk about the state of the world and Elif's encounter with the state of the world. It says in the programme, Elif, that we're going to talk about populism, so we should first define what it is. What is populism and how have you experienced it as a writer?
You know, I think I define populism as a false answer or fake answer to some very real problems. And I think the problems are real, and we need to talk about them, and we need a new approach. What is wrong is the illusion that populism could solve them. I think it can only make them worse. And just to give you, maybe to clarify, an example, in 2017, Freedom House, they published a report which said that 35 countries around the world had been going backwards 35 countries had been making progress, 71 countries, twice as many, had been going backwards with a bewildering speed. And there's no doubt that my motherland, Turkey, is one of those countries. In Turkey, we have experienced a rise of populist nationalism, which evolved into populist authoritarianism. And I think Turkey holds important lessons for open-minded, progressive-minded people everywhere, because we had elections in Turkey. We had relatively regular elections, so we had the ballot box. And when I say this, I'm not underestimating or belittling the ballot box, but all I'm saying is having elections is not enough to sustain a democracy or to achieve a democracy. In addition to that, you need definitely checks and balances, rule of law, a free media, independent academia, women's rights, minority rights, LGBTQ rights. Together with all those components, a democracy can survive. So what we're experiencing around the world, and especially in countries like Turkey, all those other components are either damaged or broken completely, and you only end up with a ballot box. That system is not a democracy. It's majoritarianism, and from majoritarianism into authoritarianism, it's a very short slide.
And that's the invidious thing about it. Because a populist leader will win an election, it gives him, or it's nearly always him, let's say him, the right to say, or the entitlement to say, I won the election, therefore I am the embodiment of the will of the people, and if you attack or criticize me, you attack or criticize the people, and you place yourself outside the nation and become an enemy of the nation. And has Turkey walked that path?
Yeah, it's an interesting pattern, isn't it? All these strong men, and it's usually men, they claim to be the voice of the people. And so when we look at populist mentality, it's quite dualistic. Always there's the people, over-romanticized, versus some enemy. Nowadays, that enemy is described as the elite, but I think we need to unpack that duality. So in the populist imagination, the people is always a monolithic whole. You know, it's a monolithic entity. Populists do not like multiplicity. They don't like pluralism. But it's a myth that the people is just one voice. I mean, imagine, look at us, so many of us, there's diversity here, and we will remember this event in different ways. But that's something the populists do not like to accept. There's actually a story that I like a lot. It goes all the way back to French Revolution, when Robespierre came to power in the name of the people and then started slaughtering people in the name of the people. There's a story there. The populists back then, they wanted to erect a statue of the people on Pont Neuf, but then they started to quarrel, because how does the people look like? You know, is the people a peasant, a worker, urban, countryside, a woman, a man, short, tall? And then in the end, that statue was not built. But it tells us something, because in the populist imagination there's still one image, one voice of the people, and they claim to symbolize that. So Erdogan, for instance, in Turkey, he says, "We are the people, who are you?" Or Chavez says, "We're all Chavez, millions of Chavez." That identification between the leader and the people is quite dangerous, because the moment you criticize the leader, you will be accused of being a traitor to the people.
There was a story that you told in a remarkable and much celebrated TED talk you gave about being visited by an American journalist, a woman journalist, and she said to you, "Well, I can understand why you're a feminist, because you live in Turkey."
Yeah.
And your response to her was?
Yes, she said this with all the good intentions, and I said to her, but that I didn't understand why she wasn't a feminist, because she lived in America.
And you came to see that she had divided the world into the benighted countries that were not yet democratic, and the more liquid countries that were not yet democratic, and solid countries like her own, which was safely, in an entrenched way, securely democratic.
But of course, she wasn't alone in this, because if we go back to 1990s, early 2000s, you will remember there was so much optimism in the world. Right? And back then people thought, okay, fascism had been defeated, communism had lost, and liberal democracy seemed to be the only triumphant power or ideology. So people thought history from that moment onwards could only go forward in a linear way. And so that comfort made them think that the countries that were lagging behind would sooner or later catch up with the rest of the world. So human rights, freedom of speech, women's rights, minority rights, those were struggles that needed to be, upheld in those liquid countries, in those backward countries. But the Western world was regarded as safe, solid, and steady. And you really didn't have to worry in the West about democracy anymore, because it was already achieved. That threshold had been passed. And I think what has changed after the year 2016 was that dualistic way of reading the world. Now we know better, and now we know that there's no such thing as solid countries versus liquid countries. Now we know that no country is immune to the rise of toxic populism or toxic nationalism. And actually we're all in the same boat together. Actually, the Polish thinker Zygmunt Bauman, he had warned us about this. He had called it liquid times. Rather than dividing the world into two, solid lands versus liquid lands, he talked about liquid times. And I think we're all living in liquid times right now.
It really made me rethink that the way you characterize that, much of my own working life. I spent 25 years on the road as a jobbing foreign correspondent, and I think I thought of myself as an emissary from the safe, solid world where human rights and democratic accountability were safe and entrenched, into the more benighted lands. And I wore those certainties like a suit of armor. And they protected me in the Congolese war, in the Bosnian war, under the rockets in Iraq. And in those places where I was physically very vulnerable, I felt a certain invulnerability because of that characterization. I don't feel invulnerable anymore. I feel a sense of vertigo. I feel the solid ground beneath my feet becoming liquid. And paradoxically, we in the entrenched democracies look to you in places like Turkey, not only for solace, but for guidance.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you share this. And I think, again, when I look at political scientists, when I look at experts in politics, let's say, they used to think that there were 4 countries that were inoculated against such turbulence. One of them was thought to be Germany, because after having experienced the horrors of the Holocaust, how can they ever make the same mistake again? So we won't see a rise of nationalism or racism or xenophobia in Germany ever again. That was the prediction until recently. Another country that was thought to be immune was Spain, because after having experienced Franco, the Spanish people appreciate pluralistic liberal democracy. So again, how can we see ever them going backwards? The third country that they thought was immune was Sweden, because it was the bastion of welfare state, social democracy. And the fourth country is the UK. Again, because it had such a solid tradition of liberal democracy, so much that it didn't even need a written constitution. When I first came to this country, I used to think the British people are so calm when they talk politics. How amazing is that? Now, after 11 years, I don't think that way anymore, you know? That calmness is gone. So I totally understand and relate to your sense of vulnerability.
And Turkey was on a very progressive trajectory, as we said, until about 10 or 11 years ago, and then lurched very quickly to the authoritarian, toxic, populist nationalism that characterizes it today. But there's more than one Turkey. That Turkey is only one Turkey.
Yeah.
There's also the Turkey, your Turkey.
Yeah.
Describe the clash and the struggle in Turkey for the ownership of the soul of Turkey.
Yeah, I think when we talk about particularly authoritarian regimes, we should always make a distinction between the people and the government, because they're not the same thing, despite what the government claims. And maybe the tragedy of lands such as my motherland is the people are usually ahead of their governments, but they lack the power to change those governments. So what we see in Turkey, alongside an increase in authoritarianism, we've seen an increase in nationalism, Turkish nationalism. We've seen an increase in Islamism, religiosity. But in my opinion, when these things increase, we also see an increase in sexism, misogyny, and homophobia. That's not a coincidence. Wherever there's a rise in nationalism around the world, there will be an increase in sexism. That whole rhetoric is built upon a certain description of manhood. So this is what we're experiencing in Turkey. But as you said, that is not the only story that comes out of Turkey. And there are many people in Turkey who are very progressive-minded, who want a proper democracy, who are genuinely concerned and demoralized with what has been happening, how we've been going backwards. And they also exist. And I think when you focus on politics in Turkey, you'll always feel a bit more pessimistic. But if you talk to people, particularly minorities, women, young people, you will feel more energized because they're more resilient. And we've seen in the last local elections that there is a resilience in Turkey. Just to maybe bring that to a conclusion, I think imagine a country in which almost the entire media is controlled by one narrative. Almost the entire social media is controlled from above. Because of something you write on Facebook, you can immediately be prosecuted. So the whole narrative is very much controlled, and the head of the Kurdish party, Kurdish majority party, HDP, is in prison, and Turkey has become the world's leading jailer of journalists. But the reason why I'm mentioning this, imagine a country in which, despite all these circumstances, half of the society continues to vote against the government. So that shows us the complexity of Turkey. It's a very multi-layered country.
So there's the Turkey that buys and reads your book and goes to hear you at literary festivals and queues up to hear you do readings. There's that Turkey. And then there's the Turkey that tried to prosecute you after you published The Bastard of Istanbul. You were looking at a prison sentence at one time of 3 years for insulting Turkishness. Was that frightening?
Yes, we have this Article 301 in our constitution, which protects Turkishness against insults. But nobody knows what that means, to be honest. So anyone can be easily prosecuted, and usually Article 301 has been used against journalists, scholars, historians several times. But it was the first time it was used against a work of fiction. When The Bastard of Istanbul was published, this is a novel that tells the story of a Turkish family and an Armenian-American family. And it talks about 1915, the massacres, deportations, using the word genocide. And the words of the fictional characters have been taken out of the book by ultranationalist groups and then used as evidence in the courtroom to prove that I was insulting Turkishness. And on the streets there were, again, ultranationalist groups spitting out my pictures, burning EU flags, because in their eyes I was associated, or I was a pawn of Western powers. Because if you criticize official history, you must have a secret agenda in their minds. So that madness went on for about a year, and in the end, my Turkish lawyer had to defend my Armenian fictional characters in the courtroom. And afterwards, we were all acquitted, me and the fictional characters. But still, after that, I had to live with a bodyguard for about a year and a half. So The reason I'm mentioning all of this is because it's very strange. I mean, countries like Turkey, again, where there's no freedom of speech, every country, when I say this, I'm aware that every country has its own official history, has its own official narrative of how the past has been. But the difference between a democracy and a non-democracy is, in a democracy, if you go to a bookstore, you can easily find books that question the official narrative and say, wait a minute, what about my story? What about her story? And the writers of those books are not prosecuted. In a non-democracy, the narrative is controlled from above. So it's difficult to write about political taboos in Turkey. But when I say this, I'm also aware that, again, in countries like Turkey, Pakistan, India, a book is not a personal item. You know, if a reader likes a book, she or he gives it to her friend or to her neighbor. People share books. On average, 5 to 6 people read the same copy. So maybe in countries where there is no proper freedom of speech, maybe stories matter even more, or they evaporate more slowly.
You said that at literary festivals like this, when you greeted a fellow writer from Venezuela or Pakistan or the liquid world, you would smile at each other in a tacitly acknowledged camaraderie of the doomed.
Yes. Yes.
But you've been recruiting more and more members to that club.
Yes. Yeah.
Including the UK and the USA.
That is true, and our club is becoming more popular now. So
let me ask you about one way that you stand against populism, toxic populism, and that is by insisting on plurality, the idea of plurality in a society, and the idea of plurality within each individual one of us. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think I'm very critical of identity politics. I respect identity politics as a starting point, but I think it cannot be where we end up. So for progressive-minded people, I don't think it can be the main way forward. I would like to think of myself as someone with multiple belongings, but I perceive every human being. So when I look at myself, of course I'm an Istanbulite, I'm very attached to Istanbul, but I'm also very attached to the Aegean, the Balkans. Put me next to a Bosnian author or a Romanian, Bulgarian, Greek author, I have so much in common. But equally, I have elements in my soul from the Middle East. So again, I have so much in common from someone coming from Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Jordan. But equally, I am a European by birth. But also by choice, the values that I share and I support. Over the years, I have become a Londoner. Over the years, I have become a British citizen. I care about this country and what's going on. And despite what Theresa May has been saying, I would like to think of myself as a citizen of the world. And that does not mean I have no sense of attachment. It does not mean that we do not care. It means you can care about multiple things at the same time. So to me, struggling for multiplicity, defending pluralism is an important part of this anti-populist struggle. And maybe part of the reason why I'm saying this is because I lived in Boston for a while in America, and while I was there in women's studies, I studied in the archives the women's movement, particularly African-American women's movement of 1960s and 70s, and it left a huge impact on me, what I found there. Because when you read people like Audre Lorde, but also when you read writers like James Baldwin, I think you find the same thing. These people were very fond of multiplicity. So Audre Lorde, for instance, she would say, look at me, I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm lesbian, I'm a mother, I'm a poet, and I'm many more things you might not be able to see at first glance. I think many of them were saying, like what Walt Whitman was saying, I contain multitudes. Now think about African-American women's movement at the time. Because they were women, they were on the receiving end of sexism. Because they were black, they were on the receiving end of racism. Because many of them were LGBT, they knew how homophobia or transphobia worked. And because many of them came from disadvantaged backgrounds, they knew how class hierarchy or inequality worked. So when they talk about power, they talk about power in a much more nuanced way than we do today. My fear today, when I look at progressives, is that we've forgotten that emphasis on multiplicity, and we are retreating more and more into our own tribes. But that is something that scares me. I don't think the answer to one kind of tribalism is forming another kind of tribalism of our own. I think we need to go beyond all echo chambers. And if I may add this, I think there's a reason why all populist demagogues love to divide. They love it when societies are divided into us versus them. They thrive upon that. So if I retreat into a description of us opposing a them, that only strengthens the hand of populist demagogues. So I think we need to find a way to go beyond this duality of us versus them, and that's going to be our main challenge.
I want to ask you about the role of emotion, and particularly mass collective emotion, in shaping the world that we live in today. This year was the 30th anniversary of the fatwa against Salman Rushdie.
Yeah.
And I spent some time after that as a young reporter, well, younger than I am now. A younger version of myself went to Yorkshire and spent time in those British Muslim communities. And I met a man who'd taken part in book burnings, and he was a middle-aged father of teenage children. And I asked him, I said, this puzzles me. If you don't like the book, don't buy it and don't read it.
Yeah.
And this was the sort of blunt-edged liberal me, trying to understand his point of view. And he said to me, and I could see the pain in his eyes, he said, understand, this book takes away our children. This book turns our children into something we don't recognize. And I could see this in him, this well of humiliation and this sense that he was being dispossessed. He was losing his place in the world. And what I thought I was looking at was a wounded patriarch.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back now, I think I understand that temperament much more than I did at the time, because in fact, on a global level, that's kind of what we're dealing with now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The idea of the wounded patriarch, the idea of communities of people who thought they had an entitlement to be top dog, who are losing their position. And I've seen it in Bosnian Serbs, I've seen it in rural Afrikaners, I've seen it in parts of the United States. And we don't yet understand how mass, especially a sense of humiliation and a sense of being dispossessed, but mass emotion is shaping our world.
Yes, I think, well, first of all, I think freedom of speech is incredibly important, and we need to defend. We need to defend that no matter what. But I understand there's another question maybe within your question, and to me, it refers to anxiety. There's a growing anxiety, and anxiety is something that's very real, and I believe we need to talk about it. Earlier, we mentioned how in 1990s and 2000s, it was a time of optimism. And back then, I think the biggest optimists were techno-optimists. And they applied that kind of optimism mostly to the part of the world where I come from, the Middle East. So for instance, when the uprising started in Iran, when there were rebellions, it was called Twitter Rebellion. And there were New York Times columnists predicting that from now on, the youth in Iran would be firing tweets to topple down dictators. When the Arab Spring started, people had so much optimism that they thought Facebook was going to bring democracy to the entire region. And again, there was so much optimism that a young couple in Egypt named their newborn baby daughter Facebook. And you will remember, perhaps, around the same time, a family in Israel, they named their third child, again to honor Facebook, they named their third child Like. So today, I think about those two children a lot, you know, Facebook in Egypt and Like in Israel. What are their lives like? Because I think fast forward today, we have entered the age of pessimism, and we have entered an age in which negative emotions guide and misguide politics. Now, when I say negative emotions, mostly fear, a lot of anger, but also a lot of anxiety. And we need to understand how anxiety works. The sense of loss. People, I think, who are only looking at data are missing this point, you know, and I think there's a lot of data fetishism. Of course, research is incredibly important, quantitative data is important, but it's not enough to understand the world. Just to give an example, out of 22 states where Trump got the most votes in America, 21 of those states are places in America that are most prone to automation. So if we're only looking at data, we don't get this picture, because then we say, well, the people who voted for Trump have jobs, But in fact, these are also people who have the anxiety of losing something. It could be a job, or it could be the anxiety that their own children might not have the same equal opportunities, or it could be demographic anxiety, the changes in majority-minority ratio. So there are lots of anxieties that we need to take into account in order to understand what's going around the world. But that's precisely why I think populism is the fake answer to these real problems.
You mentioned the 1989 as a time of great optimism and the fall of the wall. Only 4 years to the day, to the very day after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we saw the famous Ottoman bridge at Mostar in Herzegovina destroyed by Croatian nationalist artillery fire. That's an episode that I still find quite hard to talk about because Bosnia is very close to my heart. It's Ottoman heritage, and it was a place of genuine plurality.
True.
And plurality was betrayed. Ethnic supremacy fought a war on the idea of pluralistic living, the idea of sharing a space with others who saw the world differently. There's a great line, Rebecca West went there in 1936 to Sarajevo, and she said she was glad that the spring had come late because this had enabled her to see snow on the roof of a mosque. And she loved the incongruity of the image because it was a metaphor for her of this incongruous little society, a gentle Europeanized Islam sitting alongside Roman Catholicism and Serbian Orthodox Christianity. And we saw that destroyed in Bosnia. And that was part of the Ottoman legacy. The Ottoman Empire was a place of multi-ethnicity, of multiple multis. What has happened to that legacy in contemporary Turkey?
Yeah, I think when I talk about the Ottoman past, I want to be able to talk both about the beauties, but at the same time the dark side as well. Always keeping in mind that the story changes depending on who is telling the story. And actually, it was a novelist who taught me that when I was a very young student in Turkey. I never forget, I read for the first time The Bridge over the Drina. Ivo Andrić. And then there's a passage in which he's talking about the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire. So I've been to school in Turkey, and I had a much more nationalistic education in Turkey. And what I learned at school was we were a mighty empire. Wherever we went, we brought civilization and justice.
This is sounding familiar.
I know it's very familiar. Absolutely. So when I'm reading this novel, there's a dialogue actually between two peasants in the Balkans, and one of them says the Janissary system was so good thanks to it. In a way, he's saying it was so positive. Thanks to this system, our poor boys were given a very good education. And
I should just explain for those who don't know what Janissaries are. In Christian Bosnia, this is a terrible episode of rapine and dispossession where boys from Christian families were really taken off to Istanbul to be trained up as an elite military force.
Absolutely, and they formed the military background, the structure of the Ottoman Empire. They came mostly from the Balkans. So one of the peasants says, thanks to this system, our uneducated poor boys were given a chance to have an excellent education, and if they were successful, they could become even viziers. They could move the social ladder all the way up. But then the other one says, are you sure? It was so dark and painful. These boys were taken away from their families forcefully, never ever allowed to see their families again. They were converted to Islam by force. They forgot their language, their background, their religion. They never saw their mothers again. So at the expense of what? But I remember, as a student just pausing there because it had never occurred to me that the same story could be interpreted in two different ways. And it was a writer, it was a novelist that showed me this was possible. So coming back to the Balkans, of course, there was a pluralism, there was a cosmopolitan empire, and in many ways I think that was admirable. But again, the story changed depending on who was telling it. What broke it into pieces was ethno-nationalism. And I think we need to talk about ethno-nationalism. I know these are sometimes difficult conversations. In Scotland, my friends tell me our nationalism is different than the nationalism in other parts of the world. And I hear that and I understand that. But where I come from, Anatolia, Balkans, we have seen a very dark side of nationalism. So when someone says I'm a nationalist, I always pause, because to me nationalism does break people into us versus them. And sometimes it takes a financial crisis or a political crisis to make a nice nationalism an ugly nationalism. And also I always bear in mind that one kind of nationalism always triggers another kind of nationalism elsewhere. So it can become a vicious circle very easily. And of course the Balkans is full of these examples.
Let me ask you about duality of identity, because I should have said, by the way, at the start, this event is supported by the Institute for the Advanced Studies in the Humanities, and I'll be told off for not mentioning that at the start because I'm on the board. So I apologize. Thank you very much for the support you've given for this event. Duality, linguistic duality. I had a great friend called Alistair Reid. Some of you might remember him. He died about 5 years ago. He was a Scottish poet, and he translated the great Latin American poets from Spanish into English. And he said, when I live in Spanish, he didn't say when I speak Spanish, when I live in Spanish, it's as though I've grown another self.
Yeah.
I've become somebody else. You, several years ago, decided to start writing your novels in English rather than Turkish.
Yeah.
Do you think you're somebody else in English?
I think we're always somebody else when in another language. There's a very interesting study by the University of Chicago that shows we think more rationally when we express ourselves in another language. So maybe I'm an emotional person, and sometimes it helps me to write in English. You know, my connection with the English language is much more cerebral. My connection with Turkish is more emotional. But I like both, and I need both. And again, maybe that's something that nationalists in Turkey do not understand, because I've been criticized a lot in Turkey. They accused me of abandoning my mother tongue, because for them it's always an either-or duality. Whereas for me, you can be bilingual, multilingual, you can dream in more than one language, and we can commute between languages. But that said, of course, to me, English is an acquired language. I'm an outsider, I'm a latecomer, I'm an immigrant in this language. I started learning English around the age I was 10, 11, and back then I was in Madrid, and Spain was my second language, and English became third, but it never abandoned me. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because when I look at my children, for instance, they are bilingual, and they're always making fun of my mistakes, the words I can never pronounce. You know, every day we practice certain words like squirrel, I can never. And as an immigrant, I'm very much aware, I think like millions of immigrants are, of the gap between the mind and the tongue. You know, you always want to say more, and you end up saying less. That gap is very intimidating. But at the same time, I think it also is inspiring. It pushes you to pay more attention to words, concepts that can't be ferried from one language to the next. So all I'm trying to say is I want to be able to write in more than one language, even though it's a challenge for me. And over the years, I realized if my writing has melancholy, if it has sorrow, particularly longing and sadness in it, I prefer, or I find these things much easier to express in Turkish. But when it comes to humor, particularly irony, I find it much easier in English. And I think there are two things we Turks don't do very well. One of them is optimism, and the other is irony. So, you know, you need each language in a different way.
So I lived in Paris for a while, and my English-speaking French friends used to say the hardest word to say in English is squirrel.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And I want to ask you about this idea of duality. You said that you can taste words. Your writing is very sensual,
Yeah.
and you can taste words. Sunset, for example, is a spicy word.
Yeah.
And then you talk very movingly about the taste of the word motherland.
Yeah. Which is a mixture of sour and sweet. Yeah. Yeah. I can't taste every word. I can't claim that, but I do taste, or I think I can, many words. And to me, that sensuality is very important. Senses, how we connect. I think most of the things we remember in the past, we remember through senses, the taste, the smell, the sound, and we also remember emotions very well. I find that amazing, and I think we always think in stories. We remember in stories are always through senses and through emotions. So in my writing, I think it plays an important role. Maybe it's the impact of Istanbul as well, because Istanbul is a city that's full of smells and full of sounds, and not easy. It's not sterile. It's not, you know, you can't compartmentalize. Everything is constantly mixed, coexisting, but also clashing. And there's a part of me that maybe loves that, yeah.
That experience in 2006, 2007, after the Bastard of Istanbul, didn't silence you. There was a condition in the old Soviet countries, the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, called internal exile, where it became so impossible to engage in public discourse that the educated urban middle classes retreated from the public square. They retreated from public engagement with public discourse, and they did their jobs in the week, and they went to their country homes at the weekend and looked after their children, and they kept their mouths shut, and it led to a degradation of the public space. For you, that's a very dangerous place to go, isn't it? Silence is the great enemy, isn't it?
Yes, I think silence is very dangerous. But that said, I'm also aware that there is a widespread self-censorship among Turkey's literati today, not only in Turkey, in many other countries as well. Because after a while, when you retreat into those islands, you start to internalize the fear, the anxiety. You know, what will people say if I write this? What are they going to think about me? And that fear is debilitating. And slowly, slowly, it kills us inside. And I think we need to be very aware of the dangers of self-censorship. I'm not saying that I'm not affected by it, but at least perhaps what helps me is I write fiction. And novel is a very democratic space. You know, I think as novelists, even if we try to control our fictional characters, they won't listen to us. You know, they have their own independence. There have been many characters that I wanted to keep on the side, and I realized, no, they were becoming quite important figures, despite my initial aim. So the novel won't be dominated by the novelist, and that's good. You have to allow the story to lead you. You know, there's a flow. Only when the book is done and I give it to my editor, then I start to worry about what people might say, but then it's too late. You know, it has its own life, the story is born. So somehow writing fiction, I think, makes us maybe a little bit bolder, a little bit even wiser as writers than who we are in our daily lives. But you mentioned something, you talked about public space. I really find that very important. And for instance, Hannah Arendt, she used to warn us about this. We have to become more engaged. We have to become more committed. And I think what we're experiencing right now is a lot of apathy. More and more we are retreating because it's simply too much. Too much information, too much happening, and that makes us more desensitized, more indifferent, and I believe that's a very dangerous threshold, because when you read the memoirs of people who have survived dark chapters in human history, like the Holocaust, like genocides, they're almost all of them saying the same thing. You know, they ask us this question: how is it possible that such atrocities can happen? Not because people are bad. Yes, there are some bad people, but relatively speaking, their numbers are small. But still, the horrible things can happen in human history. So they're trying to find an answer to that question. And they're saying maybe the opposite of goodness is not necessarily badness. Maybe the opposite of kindness is not necessarily evil or wickedness. So they're saying the opposite of goodness is numbness. Is the moment we become numb, indifferent, you know, we stop feeling or questioning or asking questions. And I think we need to be careful about that threshold.
Twice in my reporting life, I have covered events that were later described by international courts as genocide.
Yeah.
And one of the striking things about it is that the people who were committing the genocide came to think they were serving a public good, that they were doing something actually virtuous.
Yeah.
And the language of pest control creeps in,
Absolutely.
describing their victims as rats or cockroaches or vermin.
Yeah.
And if you can think of it in that context, it becomes you're doing something quite good by getting rid of this unwanted corruption in society.
Yeah.
Do you hear that language creeping into our discourse in Britain?
Yeah. Well, it's very scary, isn't it? We've heard that language in Rwanda, we've heard that language in Myanmar, we've heard it, of course, in Bosnia. If you can dehumanize the other, whether the other is women, minorities, ethnic, sexual, anyone who is the other for whatever reason, if you can dehumanize them, from that moment onwards, you can sow the seeds of all kinds of racism, sexism, and discrimination. That's fertile ground. So it's an important turning point. And I do hear, not to that extent, of course, but I do hear the language, the rhetoric of othernization in this country as well, and that worries me. And also I hear this rhetoric. Anyone who questions my views, if I'm going to call them the enemy of the people, if tabloids can have first pages putting pictures of judges and writing enemies of the people, if critical media outlets are called enemies of the people, we know where that kind of language leads us. So I think we need to be very careful about these things. Media independence, media diversity is incredibly important. And also I think it's important to understand that we might disagree about lots of things, but we need to take care of our shared democratic ground. That's very important. The next thing that worries me is the erosion of truth. I want to give you one example to clarify. Maybe you've come across this. There were, during the elections in France, not the EU elections, the presidential elections, there was a moment when Macron, like many other politicians, he went out, he was chatting with the people. There's a video of him. He goes to a factory, and they're cleaning fish in that factory. They're cleaning eel. Because it's a very messy job, he rolls up his sleeves and he starts cleaning eel with the workers. When he's done, he goes and washes his hands, he shakes hands with the workers, and he leaves the factory. The far right in France, they took this video and they edited the video, they shortened it. In the new video, there's no more fish, no more eel. In the new video, Macron goes to a factory, he shakes hands with the workers, he looks at his hands as if he's disgusted, and he goes and washes his hands, and he leaves the factory. And the caption says, liberal elite. So the idea is he just touched an ordinary man and he has to wash his hands. I think what I'm trying to say is you might be a supporter of Macron or you might be critical of Macron. That's not my point. I will respect your views either way. But I think we should all be concerned about the erosion, the loss of truth. Because if you lose truth, if truth can be distorted, particularly through digital technologies, how are we going to ever agree about what's going on in the world? How are we going to find a common solution? So these are the areas I think we cannot be naive about.
And if you want a nightmare vision of the future, go to Putin's Russia, where nobody believes anything is true anymore.
Of course.
And there's a terrific book, the author was here a couple of years ago, called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. So you get to choose your own version of reality. And demagogues love that as well. Doubt is what they sell.
Of course.
And so let me ask you about another something else you did recently, and that was, even though you were subject to what you called a digital lynching early this year, because many people in Turkey said this book was obscene because it deals with gender violence and sexual harassment. You nonetheless used that TED talk to talk publicly about being bisexual for the first time.
Yeah.
How much thought did you give that, and how long did it take you to make that decision?
Oh, it took me a long time. I wish I could have made that decision much, much earlier in my life, and I could have talked about it. Although when I say that, I think in my novels, in my interviews, it's quite clear that I've always try to give more voice, maybe to people who have been more voiceless or pushed to the periphery. I think I'm a writer who is, of course, interested in stories, but equally in silences and people who have been silenced. So in all my novels, there is a desire to bring the periphery to the center, to make the minorities more visible. And in all my interviews, in all my articles, maybe there's again, desire for equality, dignity, and that kind of egalitarianism. But I never had the courage to say, this is also my story. I'm also bisexual, and to me, there's a background, there's a personal story to this. I could never say that in Turkey or anywhere else, because I was so worried about the reaction that I would get. And after the TED Talk went online, the reaction from Turkey was incredibly nasty. But again, when I say Turkey, mostly from the media and social media, but Islamist papers calling me pervert, nationalists accusing me of being a traitor. It was quite nasty. And I think we all know that the social media, coming back to that optimism, pessimism, for a long time we thought social media in particular had a bright side, but I think we need to talk about its dark side as well. Particularly when you are a woman, the language becomes very sexist. We need to understand how hate speech evolves and how it's targeted against different people through digital platforms. So that went on for about 7-8 weeks. It was on TV, newspapers, social media. But of course, the people who do not think that way, they only whisper. You have to be able to hear their whispers. So I would receive every now and then a letter saying, you know, I'm so glad you gave that talk because my son is gay, or my daughter is bisexual or transgender, and you made it easier maybe a little bit, or maybe someone else helped me when I made that speech. So we do help each other, but people who say these things are not shouting in the public space, and the people whose voices are the loudest, unfortunately, are the more bigoted ones.
When I was preparing for this interview, I asked a mutual friend of ours about you, and he said, this is what he said. He said, I count Elif as a friend, but beyond my great liking for her and admiration for her, I think she has a rare but beguiling combination of fierce integrity with the occasional glimpse of surprising vulnerability. And then he added, slightly reminds me of you, in fact. And as I said, I felt invulnerable at times of great vulnerability in my life. But the moments of vulnerability come later in the quiet, in the peace. And I get visited by that intense vulnerability sometimes, especially, at the going down of the sun and in the morning, in those quiet moments when you're alone. Do you feel vulnerable?
Yes, of course, and I think we all do in different degrees. And I think we need to be able to talk our emotions. Again, I come from a country where people think women are emotional, men are not. That's nonsense. I think men and women, we're all emotional creatures. We connect through emotions. And there's a beauty to that. I think there's a lot of pressure on all of us to be strong and tough and prove that toughness. Particularly when I look at women politicians, I think their job is incredibly tough because it's such a male-dominated environment. Many of them suppress their emotions. But then when I think about people like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who talks about her vulnerabilities and her anxieties, depression, and you see her crying, hugging people, and you can connect with her more easily. So to me, it's admirable. It's really very precious that we can talk about vulnerability. And I also think that in the age we're living in, we will see more and more cases of mental health problems. We will see more cases of anxiety disorders and depression. And we should be able to talk about these issues in the public space. I have experienced postpartum depression. I wrote a book about it, Black Milk. I wrote about it with humor in the end, but to write that book was very painful for me. But it taught me a lot, because I think depressions can also be golden opportunities to look within. Normally in our daily life, because we're in a hurry, we're always busy, we don't feel the necessity to look within, because everything is working fine. But when you go through a depression, because you fall down so harshly and all your pieces are scattered, you have to sit down and reassemble yourself. And there is a chance that the new self can be better than the previous one. But we have to reassemble. And I think we need to bear two things in mind. One is, depression is not a destiny. It is a season, and after that season, there will be other seasons in our lives. And the second thing is, we are not alone. It's not only happening to me. There are many of us who go through some kind of turbulence. We started with populism. I think in the age of inequalities, rising populism, rising uncertainty, liquid times, we will see more and more cases of emotional turbulence, and this should be one of the important talks in our public space.
Let's get the house lights up, because I've dominated this long enough. It's called the Little Big Interview. I hope you like the duality in the title of this. There's a gentleman there, and then I'm looking for a female voice.
There's one.
Yes.
You've moved from one country with a history of a long empire to another one, and the beneficiaries of empire tend not to feel the pain of the victims. Was there much introspection pre-Erdogan in a more liberal Turkey about the horrible side of empire, which I don't think has ever been looked into in this country, to be honest, Britain being one of the most destructive on the history of Earth. But was there any introspection in Turkey as to the crimes of the past?
Thank you so much. That's a difficult subject, only because, as you said, Turkey has a very rich long history, but at the same time, I think we're a society of collective amnesia. And many people genuinely do not know much about their own past, even their own family's past. So at school, we learn only one version of history. There's a big vacuum, actually, and that vacuum is filled by ultra-nationalistic or very religious narratives. All around the world, actually, not only in Turkey, I think there's an imperial nostalgia. This is happening in Austria, it's happening in Hungary, it's happening in Poland, in Turkey, and in this country as well, this imperial nostalgia, back in the golden age, when we were mighty, when we were, triumphant. I find that narrative very dangerous, because the past was not as glorious as we think it was. Again, depending on who's telling the story, that truth will differ. But also we're living in a new age. So that backward-looking over-romanticization of the past, which is also happening in Russia today, can be used by governments for their own political purposes, and a lot of that, unfortunately, is happening in Turkey. I'll give you just one example. Many years ago, when I was much younger, I went to Hay Festival for the first time, and I really remember just standing there by the road, looking at the road signs, because I had never seen a road sign in Welsh and in English. It had never occurred to me that in my country a road sign could be written in Turkish and Kurdish. And why not? Why can't have people the right to education in their mother tongue? Why can't I see millions of Kurds as our biggest minority? Why can't I see road signs in Kurdish and Turkish? Just to give you an example. So there's a lot we still can't talk about in Turkey.
There's a question here, and then there's one up there. Yes.
Hello. Firstly, thank you very much for a
you.
really enlightening talk. So my question is, you talked about silence being the biggest problem, and I also feel that amongst those who are getting agitated, we are largely silent and fearful, and there often is, or feels like there's a cost to speaking up.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to talk about how do we speak up, and how do we speak up in a way that respects plurality. So does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense, of course.
In a way, it's the big challenge of our age, isn't it?
It is the big challenge, and maybe it's a challenge that we need to face almost on a daily basis. We can't leave behind. But again, a small example. When the Westminster terror attack happened, you will remember in the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, there was one tweet being circulated. It was trending. And it was the picture of one young woman, wearing a headscarf. She was holding a mobile phone, and there were injured people on the pavement. And the caption under the picture said, "You see, she doesn't even care." And it turned out it was a lie. It was a deception. She was calling her family just to say, I'm okay, I'm alive, just like many people who survive a terror attack do in that situation. It didn't mean that she didn't care. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because even the decision not to retweet that tweet shows that we are active citizens. We have to be active also digital citizens and keep an eye on what's happening on the digital platforms in our public space. We don't have the luxury of being non-political. That's my opinion. But when I say we have to be political, I'm not talking about political parties, and I'm not talking about partisan politics. I'm just talking about caring about core democratic values like rule of law, freedom of speech, women's rights, minority rights, protecting each other's rights. And I think on these issues we cannot be silent. Otherwise, that public space, urban space, is unfortunately dominated by extremist discourses. And those extremist discourses, we do know that feed each other. They breed through each other. So we have to find a way to also tell people that we also exist.
Yes.
Hi. I would want to ask a question about how you define the politics. I define politics as personal.
Right.
Because I'm coming from Turkey as well.
Yeah.
And I now operate in another language right now with you, and I'm honored to be here to talk with you. The question is, when I moved here, people asked me what I think about Brexit, and I was like, we have been there, yes. And they were asking me for like kind of guidance, like Americans even, like, oh, what are we gonna do with Trump? And I was, we have been with Erdogan since I was 18, so for 17 years I have been with Erdogan, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I have read your books, and you inspire me in a way. But I also want to ask you a personal question about Istanbul, because I'm can be also considered Istanbulite, maybe.
Sure.
Because I lived there for 26 years, and I just wonder, what are your love and hate relationship with Istanbul?
A good dualistic question.
Such a beautiful.
Yeah, I am aware of the criticism of dualism, and I totally agree with that. But I also wonder what is the impact of the geography, the topography of the city.
That's great. I want to get some more questions in, if you don't mind. So,
Of course, yeah.
you need a pen. Yeah. Go on.
Thank you.
So, do you have a love-hate relationship with Istanbul?
Oh, sorry. I thought you want to take a few questions at the same time. I think I have a pendulum, relationship with Istanbul. I always miss Istanbul, and I love Istanbul like you do. But I also feel a little bit suffocated when I'm there, and then I run away, and then I go back again. But a small story, when I used to live on a street called Kazancı, the street of cauldron makers, which is briefly mentioned in this book. Even the story of that street says so much about Istanbul, because this was a place that was mostly populated by minorities, ethnic minorities in 1950s. So there were lots of Jewish families, Armenian, Greek families. Many of them had to leave. They didn't feel welcome anymore. In 1970s, sexual minorities moved in. Again, many of them had to leave, most of them by force after the military takeover in 1980. And then in 1990s, maybe liberals, feminists moved in. But when I moved in, I had an old Greek neighbor, old Jewish neighbor, old transgender neighbor. So it seemed like from every cluster of people who moved in, someone or something remained behind. And I think Istanbul is full of those stories. It feels like we're all passengers. Nothing feels solid in that city. I was there on the night of the earthquake, and on our street we had a very religious grocer who refused to sell alcohol and refused to sell liberal newspapers, and he would never talk to sexual minorities, never say salam to a sexual minority member. But on the night of the earthquake, I never forget, at 3 a.m., and this was a major earthquake, 10,000 people died in and around Istanbul. At 3 a.m., when we run out of our houses, I saw that man sitting next to my transvestite neighbor, and both of them, and her mascara was leaking, she was crying, and he was offering her a cigarette. And for a few hours, we were all one in the face of death, but of course the next morning he was not talking to her again. So Istanbul is full of these amazing, mesmerizing stories, and I think it is a treasure, particularly for artists, but it can be a difficult place too.
I'm going to take one more question before we run out of time. Yes, who's got the microphone? Yes.
Looking around this audience, it's full of oldsters. And when you were talking, I was thinking of my daughter, and we were talking together about some of these issues, how complex they are.
Yeah.
And I recommended that she read Honor, and particularly that she would identify with Esma in Honor. And I'm wondering how you think we can get this kind of plural thinking and this thinking about diversity out there with the young, who actually have got a lot of incredibly positive energy to move forward.
Thank you so much. And I think it's hard to be a young person in the age we're talking about. The sense of insecurity or uncertainty is even bigger, whether we're talking about jobs, whether we're talking about moving to another place, or sometimes mental health issues. So there's a lot that we need to sympathize with, empathize with. I so appreciate that you mentioned Honor, because it's a book that also talks about masculinity. I'm a feminist, but I think one of the most difficult conversations for us is with regards to masculinity today. And I long for a kind of women's movement that reaches out, particularly to young men, particularly young men from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and works hand in hand with them. Because clearly in patriarchal societies, women are unhappy, but I think men are unhappy as well. And we need to be able to understand that unhappiness and how that accumulates. If you happen to be a man who doesn't conform to the dominant version of masculinity, your life can be very difficult. And sometimes, unfortunately, women too can take part in the continuation of that kind of discrimination. So there are lots of conversations we need to have, more nuanced conversations, and I think we always have to reach out rather than retreat into our own tribes.
Elif is going to sign books, I think, are you?
Yeah, I was
You're going to sign books in the signing tent next door, not the bookshop across there, but next door. This has been a really special hour for me. I shall cherish it for a long, long time, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please thank Elif Shafak.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.